Section 13 of Heu-Heu, or the Monster, by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Terrible Night. Leaving the house very softly, we found that the torrential rain had dwindled to a kind of heavy drizzle, which thickened the air, while on the surface of the lake and the low-lying cultivated land there hung a heavy mist. This, of course, was very favorable to us, since even if there were watchers about, they could not see us, unless we stumbled right into them. As a matter of fact, I think that there was none, all the population of the place being collected at the ceremony in the cave. We neither saw nor heard anybody. Not even a dog barked, for these animals, of which there were few on the island, were sleeping in the houses, out of the wet and cold. Above the mist, however, the great full moon shone in a clear sky, which suggested that the weather was mending, as in fact proved to be the case. The tempest of rain, which we learned afterwards, had raged for months with some intervals of fine weather, having worn itself out at last. We reached the sluice house, and to our surprise found that the door was unlocked. Supposing that it had been left thus through carelessness by the inspecting priests, we entered softly and closed it behind us. Then I lit a candle, some of which I always carried with me, and held it up that we might look about us. Next moment I stepped back, horror-struck, for there on the coping of the water shaft sat a man with a great spear in his hand. Whilst I wondered what to do, staring at this man, who seemed to be half asleep, and even more frightened than I was myself, with the greater quickness of the savage, Hans acted. He sprang at the fellow, as a leopard springs. I think he drew his knife, but I am not sure. At any rate, I heard a blow, and then the light of the candle shone upon the soles of the man's feet as he vanished backward into the pit of water. What happened to him there I do not know. So far as we were concerned, he vanished forever. "How is this? You told us no one would be here," I said to Jemima savagely, for I suspected a trap. She fell upon her knees, thinking, probably, that I was going to kill her with the man's spear, which I had picked up, and answered, "Lord, I do not know. I suppose that the priests grew suspicious, and set one of their number to watch, or it may have been because of the great flood, which is rising fast." Believing her explanations, I told her to rise, and we set to work. Having fastened the door from within, Hans climbed up the lever, and by the light of the candle, which could not betray us, as there were no windows to the shed, fixed the 2 flasks of powder in the hole in the stone gate, immediately beneath the pin of the lever. Then, as we had arranged, he wedged them tight with pebbles that we had brought with us. This done, I procured a quantity of the sticky clay, with which the walls of the shed were plastered, taking it from a spot where the damp had come through and made it moist. This clay we stuck all over the flasks and the stones to a thickness of several inches. Immediately beneath the pin we left an opening, hoping thereby to concentrate the force of the explosion on it and on the upper rim of the hole that was bored through the sluice gate. The slow matches, which now were dry, we inserted in the holes we had made in the flasks, bringing them out through the clay, encased in 2 long hollow reeds that we had drawn from the roof of our house where we lodged, hoping thus to keep the damp away from them. Thus arranged, their ends hung to within 6 feet of the ground, where they could easily be lighted, even in a hurry. By now it was 11:15, and the most terrible and dangerous part of our task must be faced. Lifting the corpse of the dead woman, who had been killed, presumably, by a blow from the lever that morning, Hans and I, Dromana would not touch her, bore her out of the shed. Followed by Dromana with all our goods, for we dared not leave them behind, as our retreat might be cut off. We carried her with infinite labor, for she was very heavy, some 50 yards to a spot I had noted during our examination in the morning at the edge of the Rock of Offering, which spot fortunately rose to a height of 6 feet, or rather less, above the level of the surrounding ground. Here there was a little hollow in the rock face, washed out by the action of water, a small roofless cavity, large enough to shelter the 3 of us, and the corpse as well. In this place we hid, for there, fortunately, the shape of the surrounding rock cut off the glare from the 2 eternal fires, which in so much wet seemed to be burning dully and with a good deal of smoke, the nearer of them at a distance of not more than 12 paces from us. The post to which the victim was to be tied was perhaps the length of a cricket pitch away. In this hiding hole we could scarcely be discovered unless by ill fortune someone walked right on to the top of us or approached from behind. We crouched down and waited. A while later, shortly before midnight, in the great stillness, we heard a sound of paddles on the lake. The canoe was coming. A minute afterwards we distinguished the voices of men talking quite close to us. Lifting my head, I peered very cautiously over the top of the rock. A large canoe was approaching the landing steps, or rather, where these had been, for now, except the topmost, they were under water because of the flood. On the rock itself 4 priests, clad in white, and wearing veils over their faces with eye holes cut in them, which made them look like monks in old pictures of the Spanish Inquisition, were marching toward these steps. As they reached them, so did the canoe. Next from its prow was thrust a tall woman, entirely draped in a white cloak that covered both head and body, who from her height might very well be Sabeela. The priests received her without a word, for all this drama was enacted in utter silence, and half led, half carried her to the stone post between the fires, where, so far as I could see through the mist, that night I blessed the mist, as we do in church in one of the Psalms. No, it is the mist that blesses the Lord, but it does not matter. They bound her to the post. Then, still in utter silence, they turned and marched away, down the sloping rock to the mouth of the cave, where they vanished. The canoe also paddled backwards a few yards, not far, I judged, from the number of strokes taken, and there floated quietly. So far all had happened as Dromana told us that it must. In a whisper I asked her if the priests would return. She answered no. No one would come onto the rock till sunrise, when Heu-Heu, accompanied by women, would issue from the cave to take his bride. She swore that this was true, since it was the greatest of crimes for anyone to look upon the holy bride between the time that she was bound to the rock and the appearance of the sun above the horizon. Then the sooner we get to the business the better, I said, setting my teeth, and without stopping to ask her what she meant by saying that Heu-Heu would come with the women, when, as we knew well, there was no such person. Come on, Hans, while the mist still lies thick, It may lift at any moment, I added. Swiftly, desperately, we clambered onto the rock, dragging the dead woman after us. Staggering round the nearer fire with our awful burden, we arrived with it behind the post. It seemed to take an age. Here, by the mercy of Providence, the smoky reek from the fire propelled by a slight breath of air, combined with the hanging fog to make us almost invisible. On the farther side of the post stood Sabeela, bound, her head drooping forward as though she were fainting. Hans swore that it was Sabeela because he knew her by her smell, which was just like him, but I could not be sure, being less gifted in that way. However, I risked it and spoke to her, though doubtfully, for I did not like the look of her. To tell the truth, I rather feared lest she should have acted on her threat, that as a last resource she would take the poison which she said she carried hidden in her hair. Sabeela, do not start or cry out. Sabeela, it is we, the Lord Watcher by night, and he who is named Light and Darkness, come to save you, I said, and waited anxiously, wondering whether I should ever hear an answer. Presently I gave a sigh of relief, for she moved her head slightly and murmured, I dream, I dream. Nay, I answered, you do not dream, or if you do, cease from dreaming, lest we should all sleep forever. Then I crept round the post, and bade her tell me where was the knot by which the rope about her was fastened. She nodded downward with her head. With her hands she could not point, because they were tied, and muttered in a shaken voice, At my feet, Lord. I knelt down and found the knot, since if I cut the rope, we should have nothing with which to tie the body to the post. Fortunately it was not drawn tight, because this was thought unnecessary, as no holy bride had ever been known to attempt to escape. Therefore, although my hands were cold, I was able to loose it without much difficulty. A minute later, Sabeela was free, and I had cut the lashings which bound her arms. Next came a more difficult matter, that of setting the dead woman in her place, for being dead, all her weight came upon the rope. However, Hans and I managed it somehow, having first thrown Sabeela's cloak and veil over her icy form and face. Hope Heu-Heu will think her nice, whispered Hans, as we cast an anxious look at our handiwork. Then, all being done, we retreated as we had come, bending low to keep our bodies in the layer of the mist which now was thinning and hung only about 3 feet above the ground, like an autumn fog on an English marsh. We reached our hole, Hans bundling Sabeela over its edge unceremoniously, so that she fell onto the back of her sister, Dramana, who crouched in it, terrified. Never, I think, did two tragically separated relations have a stranger meeting. I was the last of our party, and as I was sliding into the hollow, I took a good look round. This is what I saw. Out of the mouth of the cave emerged 2 priests. They ran swiftly up the gentle slope of rock till they reached the 2 columns of burning natural gas, or petroleum, or whatever it was, one of them halting by each column. Here they wheeled round, and through the holes in their masks or veils, stared at the victim bound to the post. Apparently, what they saw satisfied them, for after one glance they wheeled about and ran back to the cave as swiftly as they had come, but in a methodical manner which showed no surprise or emotion. "What does this mean, Dramana?" I exclaimed. You told me that it was against the law for anyone to look upon the holy bride until the moment of sunrise." "I don't know, Lord," she answered. "Certainly it is against the law. I suppose that the diviners must have felt that something was wrong, and sent out messengers to report. As I have told you, the priests of Heu-Heu are masters of magic, Lord." "Then they are bad masters, for they have found out nothing," I remarked indifferently. But in my heart I was more thankful than words can tell that I had persisted in the idea of lashing the dead woman to the post in place of Sabeela. Whilst we were dragging her from the shed, and again when we were lifting her out of the hole onto the rock, Hans had suggested that this was unnecessary, since Dramana vowed that no man ever looked upon the holy bride between her arrival upon the rock and the moment of sunrise, and that all we needed to do was to loose Sabeela. Fortunately, some providence warned me against giving way. Had I done so, all would have been discovered, and humanly speaking, we must have perished. Probably this would have happened even had I not remembered to run back and pick up the pieces of cord that I have cut from Sabeela's wrists and left lying on the rock, since the messengers might have seen them and guessed a trick. As it was, so far, we were safe. "Now, Hans," I said, "the time has come for you to swim to the canoe, which you must do quickly, for the mists seem to be melting beneath the moon, and otherwise you may be seen." "No, boss, I shall not be seen, for I shall put that bundle from the Tree of Dreams on my head, which will make me look like floating weeds, boss. But would not the boss like perhaps to go himself? He swims better than I do, and does not mind cold so much. Also he is clever, and the Walloo fools in the boat will listen to him more than they will to me. And if it comes to shooting, he is a better shot, as I think too that I can look after the Lady Sabeela and the other lady, and know how to fire a slow match as well as he can." "No," I answered, "it is too late to change our plans, though I wish I were going to get into that boat instead of you, for I should feel happier there." "Very good, boss. The boss knows best," he replied resignedly. Then, quite indifferent to conventions, Hans stripped himself, placing his dirty clothes inside the mat, in which was wrapped the bundle of twigs from the Tree of Illusions, because, as he said, it would be nice to have dry things to put on when he reached the boat, or the next world, he did not know which. These preparations made, having fastened the bundle onto his head by the help of the bonds which we had cut off Sabeela's hands, that I tied for him beneath his armpits, he started, shivering, a hideous, shriveled, yellow object. First, however, he kissed my hand, and asked me whether I had any message for my reverend father in the place of fires, where he remarked it would be at any rate warmer than it was here. Also he declared that he thought that the Lady Sabeela was not worth all the trouble we were taking about her, especially as she was going to marry someone else. Lastly, he said, with emphasis, that if we ever got out of this country, he intended to get drunk for 2 whole days at the first town we came to where gin could be bought, a promise, I remember, that he kept very faithfully. Then he sneaked down the side of the rock, and holding his revolver and a little buckskin cartridge case above his head, glided into the water as silently as does an otter. By now, as I have said, the mist was vanishing rapidly, perhaps before a draught of air which drew out of the east, as I have noticed it often does in those parts of Africa, between midnight and sunrise, even on still nights. On the face of the water it still hung, however, so that through it I could only discover the faint outline of the canoe about 100 yards away. Presently, with a beating heart. I observed that something was happening there, since the canoe seemed to turn round, and I thought that I heard astonished voices speaking in it, and saw people standing up. Then there was a splash, and once more all became still and silent. Evidently Hans reached the boat safely, though whether he had entered it I could not tell. I could only wonder and hope. As we could do no good by remaining in our present most dangerous position, I set out to return to the sluice shed, where other matters pressed, carrying all our gear as before, but, thank goodness, without the encumbrance of the corpse. Sabeela seemed to be still half dazed, so at present I did not try to question her. Dromana took her left arm, and I her right, and supporting her thus, we ran, doubled up, back to the shed, and entered it in safety. Leaving the two women here, I went out onto the little pier, and crouched at the top of the fisherman's steps, watching and waiting for the coming of Hans with the canoe to take us off, for as you may remember, the arrangement was that I was not to fire the slow matches until it had arrived. No canoe appeared. During all the long hours, they seemed an eternity, before the breaking of the dawn did I wait and watch, returning now and again to the shed to make sure that Dromana and Sabeela were safe. On one of these visits I learned that both her father, the Walloo, and Issachar were in the canoe, which made its non-arrival not to be explained, that is, if Hans had reached it safely. But if he had not, or perhaps had been killed, or met with some other accident in attempting to board it, then the explanation was easy enough, as her crew would not know our plight, or that we were waiting to be rescued. Lastly, they might have refused to make the attempt, for religious reasons. The problem was agonizing. Before long there would be light, and without doubt we should be discovered and killed, perhaps by torture. On the other hand, if I fired the powder, the noise of the explosion would probably be heard, in which case also we should be discovered. Yet there was an argument for doing this, since then, if things went well, the water would rush in and give those priests something to think about that would take their minds off hunting for and capturing us. I looked about me. The canoe was invisible in the mist. It might be there, or it might be gone. Only if it had gone, and Hans were still alive, I was certain that, as arranged, to advise me, he would have fired his pistol, which, to keep the cartridges dry, he had carried above his head in his left hand. Indeed, I thought it probable that, rather than desert me thus, he would have swum back to the island, so that we might see the business through together. The longer I pondered all these and other possibilities, the more confused I grew, and the more despairing. Evidently something had happened, but what? What? The water continued to rise. Now all the steps were covered, and it was within an inch or two of the surface of the pier on which I must crouch. It was a mighty flood that looked as though, presently, it would begin to flow over the top of the seawall, in which case the sluice shed would undoubtedly be inundated and made uninhabitable. As I think I told you, a few yards to our right, rising above the top of the seawall to a height of 7 or 8 feet, was a great rock that had the appearance of a boulder, ejected at some time from the crater of the volcano, which rock would be easy to climb, and was large enough to accommodate the 3 of us.
Moreover, no flood could reach its top, since to do so it must cover the land beyond to a depth of many feet. Considering it and everything else, suddenly I came to a conclusion, so suddenly indeed, and so fixedly, that I felt as though it were inspired by some outside influence. I would bring the women out and make them lie down upon the top of that boulder, trusting to Dramana's dark cloak to hide them from observation, even in that brilliant moonlight. Then I would return to the shed and set light to the match, and after I had done this, join them upon the rock, whence we could see all that happened, and watch for the canoe, though of this I had begun to despair. Abandoning all doubts and hesitations, I set to work to carry out this scheme with cold yet frantic energy. I fetched the two sisters who, imagining that relief was in sight, came readily enough, made them clamber up the rock, and lie down there on their faces, throwing Dramana's large dark cloak over both of them and our belongings. Then I went back to the shed, struck a light, and applied it to the ends of the slow matches that began to smolder well and clearly. Rushing from the shed, I locked the heavy door and sped back to the rock, which I climbed. 5 minutes passed, and just as I was beginning to think that the matches had failed in some way, I heard a heavy thud. It was not very loud. Indeed, at a distance of even 50 yards, I doubted whether anyone would have noticed it, unless his attention were on the strain. That shed was well built, and roofed and smothered sounds. Also, this one had nothing of the crack of a rifle about it, but rather resembled that which is caused by something heavy falling to the ground. After this, for a while, nothing particular happened. Presently, however, looking down from my rock, I saw that the water in the sluice, which, being retained by the stone door in the shed, hitherto had been still, was now running like a mill race, and with a thrill of triumph learned that I had succeeded. The sluice was down, and the flood was rushing over it. Watching intently, a minute or so later I observed a stone fall from the coping of the channel, for it was full to the brim, then another and another, till presently the whole work seemed to melt away. Where it had been was now a great and ever-growing gap in the sea-wall, through which the swollen waters of the lake poured ceaselessly and increasingly. Next instant the shed vanished like a card-house, its foundations being washed out, and I perceived that over its site and beyond it, a veritable river, on the face of which floated portions of its roof, was fast inundating the low-lying lands behind that had been protected by the wall. I looked at the east. It was lightening, for now the blackness of the sky, where it seemed to meet the great lake, had turned to gray. The dawn was at hand. With a steady roar, through the gap in the sea-wall, which grew wider every moment, the waters rushed in, remorseless, inexhaustible. The aspect of them was terrifying. Now our rock was a little island, surrounded by a sea, and now in the east appeared the first ray from the unrisen sun, stabbing the rain-washed sky like a giant spear. It was a wondrous spectacle, and thinking that probably it was the last I should ever witness upon earth, I observed it with great interest. By this time the women at my side were sobbing with terror, believing that they were going to be drowned, as I was of the same opinion, for I felt our rock trembling beneath us, as though it were about to turn over or, washed from its foundations, to sink into some bottomless gulf, and could do nothing to help them. I pretended to take no notice of their terror, but only stared towards the east. It was just then that, emerging out of the mist on the face of the waters within a few yards of us, I saw the canoe. Hear the sound of the paddles I could not, because of the roar of the rushing water. In it, at the stern, with his pistol held to the head of the steersman, stood Hans. I rose up, and he saw me. Then I made signs to him which way he should come, keeping the canoe straight over the crest of the broken wall, where the water was shallow. It was a dangerous business, for every moment I thought it would o'erset, or be sucked into the torrent beyond, where the sluice channel had been. But those Walloos were clever with their paddles, and Hans' pistol gave them much encouragement. Now the prow of the canoe grated against the rock, and Hans, who had scrambled forward, threw me a rope. I held it with one hand, and with the other thrust down the shrinking women. He seized them and bundled them into the canoe like sacks of corn. Next I threw in our gear, and then sprang wildly myself, for I felt our stone turning. I half fell into the water, but Hans and someone else gripped me, and I was dragged in over the gunwale. Another instant, and the rock had vanished beneath the yellow, yeasty flood. The canoe oscillated and began to spin round. Happily, it was large and strong, with at least a score of rowers, being hollowed from a single huge tree. Hans shrieked directions, and the paddlers paddled as never they had done before. For quite a minute our fate hung doubtful, for the torrent was sucking at us, and we did not seem to gain an inch. At last, however, we moved forward a little, towards the rock of sacrifice this time, and within 60 seconds were safe and out of reach of the landward rush of the water. "Why did you not come before, Hans?" I asked. "Oh, boss, because these fools would not move until they saw the first light, and when the Walloo and Issachar wanted to, told them that they would kill them. They said it was against their law, boss." "Curse them all for 10 generations," I exclaimed, then was silent, for what was the use of arguing with such a superstition-ridden set? Superstition is still king of most of the world, though often it calls itself religion. These Walloos thought themselves very religious indeed. Thus ended that terrible night. End of chapter 13. Section 14 of Heu-Heu, or the Monster, by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The End of Heu-Heu. Opposite to the Rock of Offering, the canoe came to a standstill, quite close to the edge of the rock. I inquired why, and the old Walloo, who sat in the middle of the boat, draped in wondrous and imperial garments, and a headdress that, having worked itself to one side in the course of our struggles, made him look as though he were drunk, answered feebly, "Because it is our law, Lord. Our law bids us wait till the sun appears, and the glory of Heu-Heu comes forth to take the holy bride." "Well," I answered, "as the holy bride is sitting in this boat with her head upon my knee." This was true, because Sabeela had insisted upon sticking to me as the only person upon whom she could rely, and so, for the matter of that, had Ramana, for her head was on my other knee. I should recommend the glory of Heu-Heu, whatever that may be, not to come here to look for her, unless indeed it wants a hole as big as my fist blown through it, I added with emphasis, tapping my double-barreled Express, which was by my side, safe in its waterproof case. Yet we must wait, Lord, answered the Walloo humbly, for I see that there is still a holy bride tied to the post, and until she is loosed, our law says that we may not go away. Yes, I exclaimed, the holiest of all brides, for she is stone dead, and all the dead are holy. Well, wait if you like, for I want to see what happens, and I think they can't get at us here. So we hung upon our oars, or rather paddles, and waited till presently the rim of the red sun appeared and revealed the strangest of scenes. The water of the lake, swollen by weeks of continuous rain, and the recent tempest, flowing in with a steady rush that somehow reminded me of the ordered advance of an infinite army, through the great gap in the lake wall that was broadening minute by minute beneath its devouring bite. Is there anything so mighty as water in the world, I wonder? Had now flooded most of the cultivated land to a depth of several feet. As yet, however, it had not reached the houses built against the mountain, in one of which we had been lodged, nor had it overflowed the great rock of offering, which you will remember stood about the height of a man above the level of the plain, being in fact a large slab of consolidated lava that once had flowed from the crater into the lake in a glacier-like stream of limited breadth. It is true that the circumstance that the rock sloped downwards to the cave mouth seemed to contradict that theory, but this I attribute to some subsequent subsidence at its base, such as often happens in volcanic areas where hidden forces are at work beneath the surface of the earth. Well, I repeat, the rock was not yet flooded, and so it came about that, at the proper moment, as had happened on this day, perhaps for hundreds of years, Heu-Heu emerged from the cave to claim his holy bride. How could he do that? Asked Good triumphantly, thinking, I suppose, that he had caught Allan tripping. You said that Heu-Heu was a statue, so how could he come out of the cave? Does it not occur to you, Good, asked Allan, that a statue is sometimes carried? However, in this case it was not so, for Heu-Heu himself walked out of that cave, followed by a number of women, with some of the hairy folk behind them, and looking at him as he stalked along, hideous and gigantic, I understood two things. The first of these was how it came about that Sabeela had vowed to me that many had seen Heu-Heu with their eyes, as Issachar also declared he had done himself, walking stiffly. The second, why it was a law that the canoe which brought the holy bride should wait until she was removed at dawn, namely, in order that those in it might behold Heu-Heu and go back to their land to testify to his bodily existence, even if they were not allowed to give details as to his appearance, because to speak of this would, they believed, bring a curse upon them. But there wasn't a Heu-Heu, objected Good again. Good, said Allan. Really, you are what Hans called me, quite clever. With the extraordinary acumen you have arrived at the truth. There wasn't a Heu-Heu. But Good, if you live long enough, he went on with the gentle sarcasm which showed that he was annoyed. Yes, If you live long enough, you will learn that this world is full of deceptions, and that the tree of illusions does not, or rather did not, grow only in Heu-Heu's garden. As you say, no Heu-Heu existed, but there did exist an excellent copy of him, made up with a skill worthy of a high-class pantomime artist, so excellent indeed that from 50 yards or so away it was impossible to tell the difference between it and the great original as depicted in the cave. There, in all his hairy, grinning horror, walking stiffly, marched Heu-Heu, 11 or 12 feet high. Or, to come to the facts, there marched Dacha on stilts, artistically draped in dyed skins, and wearing on top of, or over his head, a wickerwork and canvas or cloth mask, beautifully painted to resemble the features of his amiable god. The pious crew of our boat saw him and bowed their classic heads in reverence to the divinity. Even Issachar bowed, a performance that I observed caused Ramana, yes, and the loving Sabeela herself, to favor him with glances of indignation, not unmixed with contempt. At least this was certainly the case with Ramana, who had lived behind the scenes, but Sabeela may have been moved by other reflections. Perhaps she still believed that there was a Heu-Heu, and that Issachar would have done better to show himself less devoted to these religious observances, and less willing to surrender her to the god's divine attentions. You may all have noticed that, however piously disposed, there is a point at which the majority of women become very practical indeed. Meanwhile, Heu-Heu stalked forward with a gait that might very literally be called stilted, and the bevy of white-robed ladies followed after him, apparently singing a bridal song, while behind these, moping and mowing, came their hairy attendants. By the aid of my glasses, however, I could see that these ladies, at any rate, were not enjoying the entertainment, whatever may have been the case with Dacha inside his pasteboards. They stared at the rising water, and one of them turned to run, but was dragged back into place by her companions, for probably on this solemn occasion flight was a capital offense. So on they came, till they reached the post to which we had tied the dead woman, whereon, according to custom, the bridesmaids skipped up to release her, while the hairy folk ranged themselves behind. Next moment, I saw the first of these bridesmaids suddenly stand still and stare. Then she emitted a yell so terrific that it echoed all over the lake like the blast of a siren. The others stared also, and in their turn began to yell. Then Heu-Heu himself ambled round and apparently had a good look, for by now someone had torn away the veil which I had thrown over the corpse's head. He did not look long, for next moment he was legging, or rather stilting, back to the cave as fast as he could go. This was too much for me. By my side was my double-barreled express rifle, loaded with expanding bullets. I drew it from its case, lifted it, and got a bead onto Heu-Heu, just above where I guessed the head of the man within would be, for I did not want to kill the brute, but only to frighten him. By now the light was good, and so was my aim, for a moment later the expanding bullet hit in the appointed spot and cleared away all that top hamper of wicker and baboon skins, or whatever it may have been. Never before was there such a sudden disrobement of an ecclesiastical dignitary draped in all his trappings. Everything seemed to come off at once, as did Dacha from the stilts, for he went a most imperial crowner that must have flattened his hooked nose upon that lava rock. There he lay a moment, then, leaving his stilts behind him, he rose and fled after the screaming women and their ape-like attendants back into the cave. Now, I remarked oracularly to the old Walloo and the others who were terrified at the report of the rifle. Now, my friends, you see what your God is made of. The Walloo attempted no reply. Apparently he was too astonished. Disillusionment is often painful, you know, but one of his company, who seemed to be a kind of official timekeeper, said that the sun being up and the holy bridal being accomplished, though strangely, it was lawful for them to return home. No, you don't, I answered. I have waited here a long time for you, and now you shall wait a little while for me, as I want to see what happens. The timekeeper, however, a man of routine, if one devoid of curiosity, dipped his paddle into the water as a signal to the other rowers to do likewise, whereon Hans hit him hard over the fingers with the butt of his revolver and held its barrel to his head. This argument convinced him that obedience was best, and he drew in his paddle, as did the others, making polite apologies to Hans. So we remained where we were and watched. There was lots to see, for by now the water was beginning to run over the rock. It reached the eternal fires, with the result that they ceased to be eternal, for they went out in clouds of smoke and steam. 3 minutes later, it was pouring in a cataract down the slope into the mouth of the cave. Before I could count 100, people began to come out of that cave in the greatest of hurries, as wasps do if you stir up their nest with a stick. Among them I recognized Dacha, who had a very good idea of looking after himself. He and the first of those who followed, wading through the water, got clear and began to scramble up the mountainside behind. But the rest were not so fortunate, for by now the stream was several feet deep, and they could not fight it. For a moment they appeared struggling amid the foam and bubbles. Then they were swept back into the mouth of the cave and gathered to the breast of Heu-Heu for the last time. Next, as though at a signal, all the houses, including that in which we had been lodged, crumbled away together. They just collapsed and vanished. Everything seemed finished, and I wondered whether I would put a bullet into Dacha, who now was standing on the ridge of rock and wringing his hands as he watched the destruction of his temple, his god, his town, his women, and his servants. Concluding that I would not, for something seemed to tell me to leave this wicked rascal to destiny, I was about to give the order to paddle away when Hans called to me to look at the mountain top. I did so, and observed that from it was rushing a great cloud of steam, such as comes from a railway engine when it is straining still with too much heat in its boiler, but multiplied 1,000,000-fold. Moreover, as the engine screams in such circumstances, so did the mountain scream, or rather roar, emitting a volume of sound that was awful to hear. "What's up now, Hans?" I shouted. "Don't know, boss. Think that water and fire are having a talk together inside that mountain, boss, and saying they hate each other, just like badly married man and woman who quarrel in a small hut, boss, and can't get out. Hiss spit, go woman. Pop bang, go man." Here he paused from his nonsense, staring at the mountain top with all his eyes, then repeated in a slow voice, "Yes, pop, bang, go man. Just look at him, boss." At this moment, with an amazing noise, like to that of a magnified thunderclap, the volcano seemed to split in two and the crest of it to fly off into space. "Boss," said Hans, "I am called Lord of the Fire, am I not? Well, I am not Lord of that fire, and I think that the farther off we get from it, the safer we shall be. Alamachter, look there." And he pointed to a huge mass of flaming lava, which appeared to descend from the clouds and plunge into the lake about a couple 100 yards away, sending up a fountain of steam and foam like a torpedo when it bursts. "Paddle for your lives," I shouted to the Walloos, who began to get the canoe about in a very great hurry. As she came round, it seemed to take an age. I saw a strange, and in a way, a terrible sight. Dacha had left his ledge and was running down into the lake, followed by a stream of molten lava, dancing while he ran, as though with pain, probably because the steam had scorched him. He plunged into the water, and just then a great wave formed, driven outwards, doubtless by some subterranean explosion. It rushed towards us, and on its very crest was Dacha. "I think that priest wants us to give him a row, boss," said Hans. "He has had enough of his happy island home, and wishes to live on the mainland." "Does he?" I replied. "Well, there is no room in the canoe," and I drew my pistol. The wave bore Dacha quite close to us. He reared himself in the water, or more probably was lifted up by the pressure underneath, so that almost he appeared to be standing on the crest of the wave. He saw us, shouted curses upon us, and shook his fists, apparently at Sabeela and Issachar. It was a horrible sight. Hans, however, was not affected, for by way of reply, he pointed first to me, then to Sabeela, and lastly to himself. After which, such was his unconquerable vulgarity, he put his thumb to his nose, and as schoolboys say, cocked a snook at the struggling high priest. The wave became a hollow, and Dacha disappeared, to look for Heu-Heu, as Hans remarked. That was the end of this cruel but able man. "I am glad," said Hans, after reflection, "that the predicant Dacha should have learned who sent him down to Heu-Heu before he went there, which he knew well enough, or he would not have been so cross, boss. Has it occurred to the boss what clever people we are, all of whose plans have succeeded so nicely? At one time I thought that things were going wrong. It was after I scrambled into this canoe, and those fools would not move to fetch you and the women, because they said it was against their law. While I was putting on my clothes, which got here quite dry because I was so careful, boss, for I had asked them to paddle to fetch you while I was still naked, and been told that they would not. I wondered whether I should try to make them do so by shooting one of them. Only I thought that I had better wait a while, boss, and see what happened, because if I had shot one, the others might have become more stupid and obstinate than before, and perhaps have paddled away after they had killed me. So I waited. which the boss will admit was the best thing to do, and everything came right in the end, having doubtless been arranged by your reverend father, watching us in the sky." "Yes, Hans, but if you had made up your mind otherwise, whom would you have shot?" I asked. "The Walloo?" "No, boss, because he is old and stupid as a dead owl. I should have shot Issachar, because he tires me so much, and I should like to save the Lady Sabeela from being made weary for many years. What is the good of a man, boss, who when he thinks his girl is being given over to a devil, sits in a boat and groans, and says the ancient law must not be broken, lest a curse should follow? He did that, boss, when I asked him to order the men to row to the steps." "I don't know, Hans. It is a matter for them to settle between them, isn't it?" "Yes, boss, and when the lady has got her mind again, and at last that hour comes, as it always does when there is something to pay, boss, I shall be sorry for Issachar, for I don't think he will look so pretty when she has done with him. No, I think that when he says kiss, kiss, she will answer smack, smack, on both sides of his head, boss. Look, she has turned her back on him already. Well, boss, it doesn't matter to me, or to you either, who have the Lady Dramana there to deal with. She isn't turning her back, boss. She is eating you up with her eyes, and saying in her heart that at last she has found a Heu-Heu worth something, even though he be small and withered and ugly, with hair that sticks up. It is what is in a man that matters, boss, not what he looks like outside, as women often used to say to me when I was young, boss." Here, with an exclamation that I need not repeat, for none of us really like to have our personal appearance reflected upon by a candid friend, however faithful, I lifted the butt of my rifle, proposing to drop it gently on Hans' toes. At that point, however, my attention was diverted from this rubbish, which was Hans' way of showing his joy at our escape, by another blazing boulder, which fell quite near to the canoe, and immediately afterwards by the terrific spectacle of the final dissolution of the volcano. I don't know exactly what happened, but sheets of wavering flame and clouds of steam ascended high into the heavens. These were accompanied by earth-shaking rumblings and awful explosions that resounded like the loudest thunder, each of them followed by the ejection of showers of blazing stones and the rushing out of torrents of molten lava, which ran into the lake, making it hiss and boil. After this came tidal waves that caused our canoe to rock perilously, dense clouds of ashes, and a kind of hot rain, which darkened the air so much that for a while we could see nothing. No, not for a yard before our noses. However, it was a most terrifying exhibition of the forces of nature, which by some connection of ideas made me think of the day of judgment. "Heu-Heu avenges himself upon us," wailed the old Walloo, "because we have robbed him of his holy bride." Here his speech came to an end for a good reason, since a large hot stone fell upon his head, and as Hans, who was next to him, explained through the fog, squashed him like a beetle. When from the outcry of his followers Sabeela realized that her father was dead, for he never moved or spoke again, she seemed to wake up in good earnest, just as though she felt that the mantle of authority had fallen upon her. "Throw that hot coal out of the boat," she said, "lest it burn through the bottom and we sink." With the help of a paddle, Issachar obeyed her, and the body of the Walloo having been covered with a cloak, we rowed on desperately. By good fortune, about this time, a strong wind began to blow from the shore towards the island, which kept back or drove away the hot rain and pumice dust, so that we could once more see about us. Now our only danger was from the rocks, such as that which had killed the Walloo, that fell into the water all round, sending up spouts of flame. It was just as though we were under heavy bombardment, but happily no more of them hit the canoe, and as we got farther off the island, the risk became less. As we found afterwards, however, some of them were thrown as far as the mainland. Still there was one more peril to be passed, for suddenly we ran into a whole fleet of rude canoes, or rather bundles of reeds and brushwood, or sometimes logs sharpened at both ends by fire, on each of which one of the hairy savages sat astride, directing it with a double-bladed paddle. I presume that these people must have been a contingent of the aboriginal woodfolk who had started for the island in obedience to the summons of Heu-Heu, where, as I have told, a great number of them were already gathered preparatory to attacking the town of Walloo. Or they may have been escaping from the island. Really, I do not know. One thing was clear. However low they may have been in the scale of humanity, they were sharp enough to connect us with the awful natural catastrophe that was happening, for squeaking and jabbering like so many great apes, they pointed to that vision of hell, the flaming volcano now sinking to dissolution, and to us. Then with their horrible yells of Heu-Heu, Heu-Heu, they set to work to attack us. There was only one thing to be done: open fire on them, which Hans and I did with effect, and meanwhile try to escape by our superior speed. I am bound to say that those hideous and miserable creatures showed the greatest courage, for undeterred by the sight of the death of their companions whom our bullets struck, they tried to close upon us, with the object, no doubt, of oversetting the canoe and drowning us all. Hans and I fired as rapidly as possible, but we could deal with only a tithe of them, so that speed and maneuvering were our principal hope. Sabeela stood up in the boat and cried directions to the paddlers, while Hans and I shot, first with rifles and then with our revolvers. Still one huge, gorilla-like fellow, whose hair grew down to his beetling eyebrows, got hold of the gunwale and began to pull the canoe over. We could not shoot him, because both rifles and revolvers were empty, nor did our blows make him lose his grip. The canoe rocked from side to side increasingly, and began to take on water. Just as I feared that the end had come, for more hairy men were almost on to us. Sabeela saved the situation in a bold and desperate fashion. By her side lay the broad spear of that priest whom Hans had killed in the sluice shed, knocking him backwards into the water pit. She seized it, and with amazing strength stabbed the great beast-like creature who had hold of the canoe, and was putting all his weight on it to force the gunwale under water. He let go and sank. By skillful steering, we avoided the others, and in 3 minutes were clear of them, since they could not keep pace with us upon their rude craft. "Plenty to do tonight, boss," soliloquized Hans, wiping his brow. "Perhaps if a crocodile does not swallow us between here and the shore, or these fools do not sacrifice us to the ghost of Heu-Heu, or we are not killed by lightning, the boss will let me drink some of that native beer when we get back to the town. All this fire about has made me very thirsty." Well, we arrived there at last. A generation seemed to have passed since I left that quay, which we found crowded with the entire terror-stricken population of the place. They received the body of the Walloo in respectful silence, but it seemed to me without any particular grief. Indeed, these people appeared to have outworn the acuter human emotions. All such extremes, I suppose, had been smoothed away from their characters by time and by the degrading action of the vile fetishism under which they lived. In short, they had become mere handsome human automata, who walked about with their ears cocked, listening for the voice of the god and catching it in every natural sound. To tell the truth, however interesting may have been their origin, in their decadence they filled me with contempt. The reappearance of Sabeela astonished them very much, but seemed to cause no delight. "She is the god's wife," I heard one of them say. "It is because she has run away from the god that all these misfortunes have happened." She heard it also, and rounded on them with spirit, having by now quite recovered her nerve, or so it seemed, which is more than could be said of Issachar, who, although he should have been wild with joy, remained depressed and almost silent. "What misfortunes?" she asked. "My father is dead, it is true, killed by a hot stone that fell upon him, and I weep for him. Still he was a very old man, who must soon have passed away. For the rest, is it a misfortune that through the courage and power of these strangers, I, his daughter and heiress, have been freed from the clutches of Dacha? I tell you that Dacha was the god. Heu-Heu, whom you worship, was but a painted idol. If you do not believe it, ask the White Lord here, and ask my sister Germana, whom you seem to have forgotten, who in past years was given to him as a holy bride. Is it a misfortune that Dacha and his priests have been destroyed, and with him the most of the savage hairy woodfolk, our enemies? Is it a misfortune that the hateful smoking mountain should have melted away in fire as it is doing now, and with it the cave of mysteries, out of which came so many oracles of terror, thus fulfilling the prophecy that we should be delivered from our burdens by a white lord from the south?" At these vigorous words the frightened crowd grew silent and hung their heads. Sabeela looked about her for a little while, then went on. "Issachar, my betrothed, come forward, and tell the people you rejoice that these things have happened. To save me from Heu-Heu, at my prayer you traveled far to ask succor of the great magician of the south. He has sent the succor, and I have been saved. Yet you helped to row the boat which took me to the sacrifice. For that I do not blame you, because you must do so, being of the rank you are, or be cursed under the ancient law. Now I have been saved, though not by you, who, thinking the White Lord dead upon the Holy Isle, consented to my surrender to the god, and the law is at an end with the destruction of Heu-Heu and his priests, slain by the wisdom and might of that White Lord and his companion. Tell them, therefore, how greatly you rejoice that you have not journeyed in vain, and they did not listen in vain to your petition for help, that I stand before them here also free and undefiled, and that henceforth the land is rid of the curse of Heu-Heu. Yes, tell the people these things, and give thanks to the noble-hearted strangers who brought them to pass, and saved me with Dramana my sister. Now, tired as I was, I watched Issachar, not without excitement, for I was curious to hear what he had to say. Well, after a pause, he came forward and answered in a hesitating voice, I do rejoice, beloved, that you have returned safe, though I hoped when I led the White Lord from the south that he would have saved you in some fashion other than by working sacrilege and killing the priests of the god with fire and water, men who from the beginning have been known to be divine. You, the Lady Sabeela, declare that Heu-Heu is dead. But how know we that he is dead? He is a spirit, and can a spirit die? Was it a dead god who threw the stone that killed the Walloo, and will he not perhaps throw other stones that will kill us, and especially you, lady, who have stood upon the rock of offerings, wearing the robe of the holy bride? Boss, inquired Hans reflectively in the silence which followed these timorous queries, do you think that Issachar is really a man, or is he in truth but made of wood and painted to look like one, as Datcha was painted to look like Heu-Heu? I thought that he was a man yonder in the black kloof, Hans, I answered, but then he was a long way off, Heu-Heu. Now I am not so sure, but perhaps he is only very frightened, and will come to himself by and by. Meanwhile, Sabeela was looking her extremely handsome lover up and down. Up and down she looked him, and never a word did she say, at least to him. Presently, however, she spoke to the crowd in a commanding voice thus, Take notice that my father being dead, I am now the Walloo, and one to be obeyed. Go about your tasks, fearing nothing, since Heu-Heu is no more, and the most of the hairy folk are slain. I depart to rest, taking with me these, my guests and deliverers. And she pointed to me and Hans. Afterwards, I will talk with you, and with you also, my lord Issachar. Bear the late Walloo, my father, to the burial place of the Walloos. Then she turned, and followed by us and the members of her household, went to her home. Here she bade us farewell for a while, since we were all half dead with fatigue and sorely needed rest. As we parted, she took my hand and kissed it, thanking me with tears welling from her beautiful eyes for all that I had done, and Dramana did likewise. How comes it, boss, said Hans, as we ate food and drank of the native beer before we lay down to sleep, that those ladies did not kiss my hand, seeing that I too have done something to help them? Because they were too tired, Hans, I answered, and made one kiss serve for both of us. I see, boss, but I expect that tomorrow they will still be too tired to kiss poor old Hans. Then he filled the cup, out of which he had been drinking, with the last of the liquor from the jar, and emptied it at a swallow. There, boss, he said, that's only right. You may take all the kisses, so long as I get the beer. Exhausted as I was, I could not help laughing, although, to tell the truth, I should have liked another glass myself. Then I tumbled onto the couch and instantly went to sleep. It is a fact that we slept all the rest of that day and all the following night, waking only when the first rays of the sun shone into our room through the window place. At least I did, for when I opened my eyes, feeling a different creature, and blessing heaven for its gift of sleep to man, Hans was already up and engaged in cleaning the rifles and revolvers. I looked at the ugly little Hottentot, reflecting how wonderful it was that so much courage, cunning, and fidelity should be packed away within his yellow skin and projecting skull. Had it not been for Hans, without a doubt I should now be dead, and the women also. It was he who had conceived the idea of letting down the sluice gate by exploding gunpowder beneath the pin of the lever. I had racked my brain for expedients, but this, the only one possible, escaped me. How tremendous had been the results of that inspiration, all of them due to Hans. Although certain ideas had occurred to me, the most that I had hoped to do was to flood the low-lying lands, and perhaps the cave, in order to divert the attention of the priests while we were attempting to escape. As it was, we had loosened the forces of nature with the most fearful results. The water had run down the vent holes of the eternal fires and into the bowels of the volcano, there to generate steam in enormous volumes, of which the imprisoned strength had been so great that it had rent the mountain like a rotten rag, and destroyed the home of Heu-Heu forever, and with it all his votaries. It was a fearful event, in which I thought I saw the mind of Providence acting through Hans. Yes, the cunning of the Hottentot had been used by the powers above to sweep from the earth a vile tyranny and to destroy a blood-soaked idol and its worshippers. Without a doubt, or so I believe in my simple faith, this had been designed from the beginning, when some escaped follower of Heu-Heu painted the picture in the Bushman's cave. Probably hundreds of years ago, it was already designed. So was Zikali's desire for a certain medicine, or his insatiable thirst for knowledge, or whatever it was that caused him to persuade me to undertake this mission. And so was all the rest of the story. Again, with what wonderful judgment Hans had acted after his brave swim to the canoe. Had he tried to force those fetish-ridden cravens to come to our rescue at once, as I directed him to do, the probability was that, fearing to break their silly law, they would have resisted, or perhaps have rowed right away, leaving us to our fate after knocking him on the head with a paddle. But he had the patience to wait, although, as he told me afterward, his heart was torn in two with anxiety for my sake. Balancing everything in his artful and experienced mind, he had found patience to wait until the conditions of their law were fulfilled, when they came willingly enough. From Hans my thoughts turned to Issachar. How was it that this man's character had changed so completely since he arrived in his native country? His journey to seek aid, made alone, over hundreds of miles, was a really remarkable performance, showing great courage and determination. Also, as a guide, although silent and abstracted, he had never lacked for resource or energy. But from the day that he arrived home, morally he had gone to pieces. It was with the greatest difficulty that he could be persuaded to row us to the island, where at the first sign of danger he had left us to our fate and fled away. Again, he had meekly helped to conduct Sabeela, whom, when he was at the Black Kloof, evidently he loved to desperation, to her doom, without lifting a finger to save her from a hideous destiny. Lastly, only a few hours ago, he had made a pusillanimous and contemptible speech which I could see shocked and disgusted his betrothed, who for her part, after her rescue and the death of her father, seemed to have gained the courage that he had lost, and more. It was inexplicable, at any rate to me, and in my bewilderment I referred the problem to Hans. He listened while I set out the case as it appeared to me, then answered, "The boss does not keep his eyes open, at any rate in the daytime, when he thinks everything is safe. If he did, he would understand why Issachar has become soft as a heated bar of iron. What makes men soft, boss?" "Love," I suggested. "Yes, at time, love makes some men soft. I mean men like the boss. And what else, boss?" "Drink," I answered savagely, getting it back on Hans. "Yes, at time, drink makes some men soft. Men like me, boss, who know that now and again it is wise to cease from being wise, lest heaven should grow jealous of our wisdom and want to share it. But what makes all men soft?" "I don't know." "Then, once more, I must teach the boss, as his reverend father, the predicant, told me to do, when I saw that the boss had used up all his wits, saying to me before he died, 'Hans, whenever you perceive that my son Allan, who does not always look where he is going, walks into water and gets out of his depth, swim in and pull him out, Hans.'" "You little liar," I ejaculated, but taking no notice, Hans went on. "Boss, it is fear that makes all men soft. Issachar is bending about like the heated ramrod, because within him burns the fire of fear." "Fear of what, Hans?" "As I have said, if the boss had kept his eyes open, he would know. Did not the boss notice a tall, dark-faced priest, before whom the crowd parted, who came up to Issachar when first we landed on the quay here?" "Yes, I saw such a man. He bowed politely, and I thought he was greeting Issachar and making him some present." "And did the boss see what kind of present he made him and hear his words of welcome?" "The boss shakes his head. Well, I did. The present he gave to Issachar was a little skull carved out of black ivory or shell, or it may have been of polished lava rock, and the words of welcome were, 'The gift of Heu-Heu to the Lord Issachar, that gift which Heu-Heu sends to all who break the law and dare to leave the land of the Walloos.' Those were the words, for standing nearby I heard them, though I kept them from the boss, waiting to see what would happen afterwards. Then the priest went away, and what Issachar did with the little black skull I do not know. Perhaps he wears it round his neck, as he hasn't got a watch chain, just as the boss used to wear things that ladies had given him, or their pictures in a little silver brandy flask." "Well, and what about this skull, Hans? What does it mean?" "Boss, I made inquiries of an old man in that canoe, to pass the time away, boss, as Issachar was at the other end and could not hear me. It means death, boss. Does not the boss remember how we were told at the Black Kloof that those who dared to leave the land of Heu-Heu were always smitten with some sickness and died? Well, boss, Issachar got out all right and left the sickness behind him. I expect because the priest did not know that he was going, but he made a mistake, boss, that of coming back again, being drawn by his love of Sabeela, just as a fish is drawn by the bait on the hook, boss, and now the hook is fast in his mouth. For the priests knew of his return well enough, boss, and of course were waiting for him." "What do you mean, Hans? How can the priests hurt Issachar, especially when they are all dead?" "Yes, boss, they are all dead, and can harm no one. But Issachar is right when he says that Heu-Heu is not dead, because the devil never dies, boss. His priests are dead, but still Heu-Heu could kill the old Walloo, and so he can kill Issachar. There is a great deal in this fetish business, boss, that good Christians like you and I do not understand. It won't work on Christians, boss, which is why Heu-Heu can't kill us. But those who worship the Black One, at last the Black One takes by the throat. I thought to myself that here Hans, though he did not know it, was enunciating one of the profoundest and most fundamental of truths, since those who bow the knee to Baal are Baal's servants and live under his law, even to the death. And what is Baal but Heu-Heu, or Satan? The fruit is always the same, by whatever name the tree may be called. However, I did not enter upon this argument with Hans, whom it would have bewildered, but only asked him what he meant, and what he imagined was going to happen to Issachar. He answered, "I mean just what I have said, boss. I mean that Issachar is going to die. That old man told me that those who receive the black skull always die within the month, and often more quickly. From the look of him, I should think that Issachar will not last more than a week. Although so handsome, he is really very dull, boss, so it does not much matter, especially as the Lady Sabeela will get over it quite soon. That is why Issachar has changed, boss. It is because the fear of death is on him. In the same way Sabeela has changed because the fear of death, and what to her perhaps is worse, has passed away." "Bosh!" I exclaimed, but internally I had my doubts. I knew something of this fetish business, although I believed it to be the greatest of rubbish. I was sure that it is extremely dangerous rubbish. The secret soul of man, especially of savage or primitive and untaught man, or the subconscious self, or whatever you choose to call it, is a terrible entity when brought into action by the hereditary superstitions that are born in his blood. In 9 cases out of 10, if the victim of those superstitions is told with the accustomed ceremonies by the oracle of the god or devil from which they flow that he will die, he does die. Nothing kills him, but he commits a kind of moral suicide. As Hans had said, fear makes him soft. Then some kind of nervous disease penetrates his system, and at the appointed hour withers up his physical life and causes him to pass away. Such, as it proved, was to be the fate of that Apollo-like person, the unhappy Issachar. End of section 14. Section 15 of Heu-Heu, or the Monster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Sabeela's Farewell. Now, of this story, there is little left to tell, and as it is very late, and I see that you are all yawning, my friends, this was not true, for we were deeply interested, especially over the moral or spiritual problem of Issachar. I will cut that little as short as I can. It shall be a mere footnote. After we had eaten that morning, we went to see Sabeela, whom we found very agitated. This was natural enough, considering all she had gone through, as after mental strain and the passing of great perils, a nervous reaction invariably follows. Also, in a sudden and terrible fashion, she had lost her father, to whom she was attached. But the real cause of her distress was different. Issachar, it seemed, had been taken very ill. Nobody knew what was the matter with him, but Sabeela was persuaded that he had been poisoned. She begged me to visit him at once and cure him, a request that made me indignant. I explained to her that I was no authority on their native poisons, if he suffered from anything of the sort, and had few medicines with me, the only one of which that dealt with poisons was an antidote to snake bites. However, as she was very insistent, I said that I would go and see what I could do, which would probably be nothing. So together with Hans, I was conducted by some of the old headmen, or counselors, of the Walloo, such people as in Zululand we should call Indunas, to the house of Issachar, a rather fine building of its sort at the other end of the town. We walked by the road that ran along the edge of the lake, which gave us an opportunity to observe the island, or rather what had been the island. Now it was nothing but a low dark mass, over which hung dense clouds of steam. When the winds stirred these clouds, I saw that beneath them were red streams of lava that ran into the lake. There were no more eruptions, and the volcano appeared to have vanished away. Much dust was still falling. It lay thick upon the roadway, and all the trees and other vegetation were covered with it, turning the landscape to a hue of ashen gray. Otherwise, no damage had been done on the mainland, except that, here and there, boulders had fallen, and some of the lower-lying fields were inundated by the great flood, which was now abating, although the river still overflowed its banks. We reached the house of Issachar, and were shown into his chamber, where he lay upon a couch of skins, attended by some women who, I understood, were his relatives. When Hans and I entered, these women bowed and went out, leaving us alone with the patient. A glance told me that he was a dying man. His fine eyes were fixed on vacancy. He breathed in gasps. His fingers clasped and unclasped themselves automatically, and from time to time he was taken with violent shiverings. These I thought must be due to some form of fever, until I had tested his temperature with the thermometer I had in my little medicine case, and found that it was 2 degrees below normal. On being questioned, he said that he had no pain, and suffered only from great weakness and from a whirling of the head, by which I suppose he meant giddiness. I asked him to what he attributed his condition. He answered, "To the curse of Heu-Heu, Lord Macumazahn. Heu-Heu is killing me." I inquired why, for to argue about the folly of the business was futile, and he replied, "For 2 reasons, Lord. First, because I left the land without his leave, and secondly, because I rode you and the yellow man called Light in Darkness to the Holy Isle, to visit which, unsummoned, is the greatest of crimes. For this cause I must die, more quickly than otherwise I should have done. But in any case my doom was certain, because I left the land to seek help for Sabeela. Here is the proof of it." And from somewhere about his person he produced the little black death's head which Hans had described to me. Then, without allowing me to touch the horrid thing, he hid it away again. I tried to laugh him out of this idea, but he only smiled sadly and said, "I know that you must have thought me a coward, Lord, because of the way I have borne myself since we reached this town of Walloo. But it was the curse of Heu-Heu working within me that changed my spirit. I pray you to explain this to Sabeela, whom I love, but who I think also believes me a coward, for yesterday I read it in her eyes. Now, while I have still strength, I would speak to you. First, I thank you and the Yellow Man, light and darkness, who by courage or by magic, I know not which, have saved Sabeela from Heu-Heu, and have destroyed his house and his priests, and I am told his image. Heu-Heu, it is true, lives on, since he cannot die, but henceforward here he is without a home, or a shape, or a worshipper, and therefore his power over the souls and bodies of men is gone, and among the Walloos, in time, his worship will die out. Perhaps no more of my people will perish by the curse of Heu-Heu, Lord. But why should you die, Issachar? Because the curse fell on me first, Lord, while Heu-Heu reigned over the Walloos, as he has done from the beginning, he who was once their earthly king. I began to combat this nonsense, but he waved his hand in protest and went on. Lord, my time is short, and I would say something to you. Soon I shall be no more, and forgotten, even by Sabeela, whose husband I had hoped to become. I pray therefore that you will marry Sabeela. Here I gasped, but held my peace till he had finished. Already I have caused her to be informed that such is my last wish. Also I have caused all the elders of the Walloos to be informed, and at a meeting held this morning they decided that this marriage would be right and wise, and have sent a messenger to tell me to die as quickly as I can, in order that it may be arranged at once. Great heavens! I exclaimed, but again he motioned to me to be silent, and went on. Lord, although she is not of your race, Sabeela is very beautiful, very wise also, and with you for her husband, she may be able once more to build up the Walloos into a great people, as tradition says they were in the old days, before there fell upon them the curse of Heu-Heu, which is now broken. For you too are wise and bold, and know many things which we do not know, and the people will serve you as a god, and perhaps come to worship you in place of Heu-Heu, so that you found a mighty dynasty. At first this thought may seem strange to you, but soon you will come to see that it is great and good. Moreover, even if you were unwilling, things must come about as I have said. Why? I asked, unable to contain myself any longer. Because, Lord, here in this land you must spend the rest of your life, for in it now you are a prisoner, nor with all your courage can you escape, since none will row you down the river, nor can you force a way, for it will be watched. Moreover, when you return to the house of the Walloo, you will find that your cartridges have been taken, so that except for a few that you have about you, you are weaponless. Therefore, as here you must live, it is better that you should do so with Sabeela, rather than with any other woman, since she is the fairest and the cleverest of them all. Also by right of blood, she is the ruler, and through her you will become Walloo, as I should have done according to our custom. At this point he closed his eyes, and for a while appeared to become senseless. Presently he opened them again, and staring at me, lifted his feeble hands and cried, "Greeting to the Walloo! Long life and glory to the Walloo!" Nor was this all, for to my horror, from the other side of the partition that divided the house, I heard the women whom I have mentioned, echo the salutation. Greeting to the Walloo, long life and glory to the Walloo. Then again Issachar became senseless. At least nothing I said seemed to reach his understanding. So, after waiting for a time, Hans and I went away, thinking that all was over. This, however, was not so, since he lived till nightfall, and I was told recovered his senses, for some hours before the end, during which time Sabeela visited him, accompanied by certain of the notables or elders. It was then, as I suppose, that this ill-fated but most unselfish Issachar, the handsomest man whom I ever beheld, to his own satisfaction, if not to mine, settled everything for what he conceived to be the welfare of his country and his lady love. "Well, boss," said Hans, when we were outside the house, "I suppose we had better go home. It is your home now, isn't it, boss?" "No, boss, it is no use looking at that river, for you see these Walloos are so kind that they have already provided you with a chief's escort." I looked. It was true enough. In place of the one man who had guided us to the house, there were now 20 great fellows, armed with spears, who saluted me in a most reverential manner, and insisted upon sticking close to my heels, I presume in case I should try to take to them. So back we went, the guard of 20 marching in a soldier-like fashion immediately behind, while Hans declaimed at me. "It is just what I expected, boss, for of course, if a man is very fond of women, in his inside, boss, they know it and like him. No need to tell them in so many words, boss, and being kind-hearted, are quite ready to be fond of him. This is what has happened here, boss. From the moment that the Lady Sabeela saw you, she didn't care a pinch of snuff for Issachar, although he was so good-looking and had walked such a long way to help her. No, boss, she perceived something in you which she couldn't find in 2 yards and a bit of Issachar, who, after all, was an empty kind of a drum, boss, and only made a noise when you hit him. A little noise for a small tap, boss, and a big noise for a bang. Moreover, whatever he was, he is done for now, so it is no use wasting time talking about him. Well, this won't be such a bad country to live in now that the most of these Heu-Heu are dead. Look, there are some of their bodies lying on the shore, and no doubt the beer can be brewed stronger, and there is tobacco. So it will be all right till we get tired of it, boss, after which perhaps we shall be able to run away. Still, I am glad none of them wish to marry me, boss, and make me work like a whole team of oxen to drag them out of their mud holes." Thus he went on, pouring out his bosh by the yard, and literally I was so crushed that I couldn't find a word in answer. Truly, it is the unexpected that always happens. During the last few days, I had foreseen many dangers and dealt with some, but this was one of which I had never dreamed. What a fate! To be kept a prisoner in a kind of gilded cage, and made to labor for my living too, like a performing monkey. Well, I would find a way between the bars, or my name wasn't Allan Quartermain. Only what way? At the time I could see none, for those bars seemed to be thick and strong. Moreover, there were those gentlemen with the spears behind. In due course we arrived at the Walloo's house, without incident, and went straight to our room, where after investigation in a corner, Hans called out, "Issachar was quite right, boss. All the cartridges have gone, and the rifles also. Now we have only got our pistols, and 24 rounds of ammunition between us. I looked. It was so. Then I stared out of the window place, and behold, there in the garden were the 20 men, already engaged in marking out ground for the erection of a guard hut. "They mean to settle there, so as to be nice and handy in case the boss wants them, or they want the boss," said Hans significantly, adding, "I believe that wherever he goes, the Walloos always has an escort of 20 men." Now, for the next few days, I saw nothing of Sabeela or of Dramana either, since they were engaged in the ceremonious obsequies, first of the Walloo, and next of the unlucky Issachar, to which for some religious reason or other I was not invited. Certain headmen or indunas, however, were always waiting to pounce on me. Whenever I put my nose out of doors they appeared, bowing humbly, and proceeded to take the occasion to instruct me in the history and customs of the Walloo people, till I thought that my boyhood had returned, and I was once more reading Sandford and Merton, and acquiring knowledge through the art of conversation. Those old gentlemen bored me stiff. I tried to get rid of them by taking long walks at a great pace, but they responded nobly, being ready to trot by my side till they dropped, talking. Moreover, if I could outwalk those ancient counsellors, the guard of 20, who formed a kind of chorus on these expeditions, were excellent hands with their legs, as an Irishman might say, and never turned a hair. Sometimes they turned to me, however, if they thought I was going where I should not, since then half of them would dart ahead and politely bar the way. At length, on the 3rd or 4th day, all the ceremonies were finished, and I was summoned into Sabeela's presence. As Hans said afterwards, it was all very fine. Indeed, I thought it pathetic, with its somewhat tawdry conditions of ancient, almost forgotten ceremonial, inherited from a highly civilized race that was now sinking into barbarism. There was the Lady Sabeela, very beautiful to see, for she was a lovely woman, and grandly dressed in a half-wild fashion, who played the part of a queen, and not without dignity, as perhaps her ancestresses had done thousands of years before on some greater stage. Here too were her white-haired attendants, or indunas, the same who bored me out walking, representing the counsellors and high officials of forgotten ages. Yet the queen was no longer a queen. She was merging into the savage chieftainess, as the counsellors were into the chattering mob that surrounds such a person in 1,000 kraals or towns of Africa. The proceedings, too, were very long, for each of these counsellors or elders made a speech in which he repeated all that the others had said before, narrating with variations everything that happened in the land since I had set foot within it, together with fancy accounts of what Hans and I had done upon the island. From these speeches, however, I learned one thing, namely, that most of the wild hairy folk who were named Heu-Heu had perished in the great catastrophe of the blowing up of the mountain. Only a few, together with the old men, the children, and the females, being left to carry on the race. Therefore, they said, the Walloos were safe from attack, at any rate for a couple of generations to come, as might be learned from the wailings which arose in the forest at night, that, as a matter of fact, I had heard myself, pathetic and horrible sounds of almost animal grief. This, said these merciless sages, gave the Walloos a great opportunity, for now was the time to hunt down and kill the wood folk, to the last woman and child, a task which they considered I was eminently fitted to carry out. When they had all spoken, Sabeela's turn came. She rose from her throne-like chair and addressed us with real eloquence. First of all, she pointed out that she was a woman suffering from a double grief, the death of her father and that of the man to whom she had been affianced, losses that made her heart heavy. Then, very touchingly, she thanked Hans and myself for all we had done to save her. But for us, she said, either she would now have been dead, or nothing but a degraded slave in the house of Heu-Heu, which we had destroyed together with Heu-Heu himself, with the result that she and the land were free once more. Next, she announced in words, which evidently had been prepared, that this was no time for her to think of past sorrows or love, who now must look to the future. For a man like myself, there was but one fitting reward, and that was the rule over the Walloo people, and with it the gift of her own person. Therefore, by the wish of her counselors, she had decreed that we were to be wed on the 4th morning from that of the present day, after which, by right of marriage, I was publicly to be declared the Walloo. Meanwhile, she summoned me to her side, where an empty chair had been set in preparation for this event, that we might exchange the kiss of betrothal. Now, as may be imagined, I hung back. Indeed, never have I felt more firmly fixed to a seat than at that fearsome moment. I did not know what to say, and my tongue seemed glued to the roof of my mouth. So I just sat still, with all those old donkeys staring at me, Sabeela watching me out of the corners of her eyes and waiting. The silence grew painful, and in its midst Hans coughed in his husky fashion, then delivered himself thus. "Get up, boss," he whispered, "and go through with it. It isn't half as bad as it looks, and indeed, some people would like it very much. It is better to kiss a pretty lady than to have your throat cut, boss, for that is what I think will happen if you don't, because a woman whom you won't kiss after she has asked you in public always turns nasty, boss." I felt that there was force in this argument, and to cut a long story short, I went up into that chair and did well all that was required. Lord, what a fool I felt, while those idiots cheered, and Hans below grinned at me like a whole cage full of baboons. However, it was but ceremonial, a mere formality, just touching the brow of the fair Sabeela with my lips and receiving an acknowledgment in kind. After this we sat a while side by side, listening to those old Walloo counselors chanting a ridiculous song, something about the marriage of a hero to a goddess, which I presume they must have composed for the occasion. Under cover of the noise, which was great, for they had excellent lungs, Sabeela spoke to me in a low voice and without turning her face or looking at me. "Lord," she said, "try to look less unhappy, lest these people should suspect something and listen to what we are saying. The law is that we should meet no more till the marriage day, but I must see you alone tonight. Have no fear," she added with a rather sarcastic smile, "for although I must be alone, you can bring your companion with you, since what I have to say concerns you both. Meet me in the passage that runs from this chamber to your own at midnight when all sleep. It has no window places, and its walls are thick, so that there we can be neither seen nor heard. Be careful to bolt the door behind you, as I will that of this chamber. Do you understand?" Clapping my hands hilariously to show my delight in the musical performance, I whispered back that I did. "Good. When the singing comes to an end, announce that you have a request to make of me. Ask that tomorrow you may be given a canoe and paddlers to row you to the island, to learn what has happened there, and to discover whether any of the woodfolk are still alive upon its shores. Say that, if so, measures must be taken to make an end of them, lest they should escape. Now speak no more." At length the song was finished, and with it the ceremony. To show that this was over, Sabeela rose from her chair and curtsied to me, whereon I also rose and returned the compliment with my best bow. Thus then we bade a public farewell of each other until the happy marriage morn. Before we parted, however, I asked as a favor, in a loud voice, that I might be permitted to visit the island, or at any rate to row round it, giving the reasons she had suggested. To this she answered, "Let it be as my lord wishes," and before anyone could raise objections, withdrew herself, followed by some serving women and by Dramana, who I thought did not seem too pleased at the turn events had taken. I pass on to that midnight interview. At the appointed time, or rather a little before it, I went into the passage, accompanied by Hans, who was most unwilling to come, for reasons which he gave in a Dutch proverb to the effect of our own, that two's company and three's none. Here we stood in the dark and waited. A few minutes later the door at the far end of it opened. It was a very long passage, and walking down it appeared Sabeela, clad in white and bearing in her hand a naked lamp. Somehow, in this garb and these surroundings, thus illuminated, she looked more beautiful than I had ever seen her, almost spirit-like indeed. We met, and without any greeting she said to me, "Lord, watcher by night, I find you watching by night according to my prayer. It may have seemed a strange prayer to you, but hearken to its reason. I cannot think that you believe me to desire this marriage, which I know to be hateful to you, seeing that I am of another race to yourself, and that you only look upon me as a half-savage woman whom it has been your fortune to save from shame or death. Nay, contradict me not, I beseech you, since at times the truth is good. Because it is so good, I will add to it, telling you the reason why I also do not desire this marriage, or rather the greatest reason, namely, that I loved Issachar, who from childhood had been my playmate until he became more than playmate. Yes, I interrupted, and I know that he loved you. Only then, why was it that on his deathbed he himself urged on this matter? Because, Lord, Issachar had a noble heart. He thought you the greatest man whom he had ever known, half a god indeed, for he told me so. He held also that you would make me happy and rule this country well, lifting it up again out of its long sleep. Lastly, he knew that if you did not marry me, you and your companion would be murdered. If he judged wrongly in these matters, it must be remembered, moreover, that his mind was blotted with poison that had been given to him. For myself, I am sure that he did not die of fear alone. I understand. All honor be to him, I said. I thank you. Now, Lord, know that, although I am ignorant, I believe that we live again beyond the gate of death. Perhaps that faith has come down to me from my forefathers when they worshipped other gods besides the devil Heu-Heu. At least it is mine. My hope is, therefore, that when I have passed that gate, which perhaps will be before so very long, on its farther side I shall once more find Issachar as he was before the curse of Heu-Heu fell upon him, and he drank the poison of the priests. And for this reason I desire to wed no other man. All honor be to you also, I murmured. Again, I thank you, Lord. Now let us turn to other matters. Tomorrow, after midday, a canoe will be ready, and in it you will find your weapons that have been stolen and all that is yours. It will be manned by 4 rowers, men known to be spies of the priests of Heu-Heu, stationed here upon the mainland to watch the Walloos, who in time would themselves have become priests. Therefore, now that Heu-Heu has fallen, they are doomed to die. Not at once, but after a while, perhaps, as it will seem, by sickness or accident, because if they live, the Walloo counselors fear lest they should re-establish the rule of Heu-Heu. They know this well, and therefore they desire above all things to escape the land while their life is yet in them. Have you seen these men, Sabeela? Nay, but Dromana has seen them. Now, Lord, I will tell you something, if you have not guessed it for yourself, though I do this not without shame. Dromana does not desire our marriage, Lord. You saved Dromana as well as myself, and Dromana, like Issachar, has come to look on you as half a god. Need I say more, save that, of course, for this reason, she does desire your escape, since she would rather that you went free, and were lost to both of us, than that you should bide here and marry me. Have I said enough? Plenty, I answered, knowing that she spoke truth. Then, what is there to add, save that I trust all will go well, and that by the dawn of the day that follows this, you and the yellow man your servant will be safely out of this accursed land. If that comes about, as I believe it will, for after the dusk has fallen and before the moon rises, those who guide the canoe will bring it, not to the quay, but into the mouth of the river, down which you must paddle by the moonlight. Then I pray of you at times, in your own country, to think of Sabeela, the broken-hearted chieftainess of a doomed people, as day by day, when she rises and lays herself down to sleep, she will think of you, who saved her and all of us from ruin. My Lord, farewell, and to you, light and darkness, also farewell. Then she took my hand, kissed it, and without another word, glided away as she had come. This was the last that I ever saw or heard of Sabeela the Beautiful. I wonder whether she lived long. Somehow I do not think so. That night I seemed to see death in her eyes. End of section 15. Section 16 of Heu-Heu or the Monster by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, The Race for Life. Now, like a Scotch parson, I have come to lastly, that inspiring word at which the sleepiest congregation awakes. The morning following this strange midnight meeting, Hans and I spent in our room, for it appeared to be the ancient Walloo etiquette that, save by special permission, the prospective bridegroom should not go out for several days before the marriage. I suppose because of some primitive idea that his affections might be diverted by the sight of alien beauty. At midday we ate, or, so far as I was concerned, pretended to eat, for anxiety took away my appetite. A little while afterwards, to my intense relief, the captain of our prison wardens, for that is what they were, appeared and said that he was commanded to conduct us to the canoe which was to paddle us, to inspect what remained of the island. I replied that we would graciously consent to go, so, taking all our small possessions with us, including a bundle containing our spare clothes and the twigs from the Tree of Illusions, we departed and were escorted to the quay by our guards, of whose faces I was heartily tired. Here we found a small canoe awaiting us, manned by 4 secret-faced men, strong fellows, all of them, who raised their paddles in salute. Apparently the place had been cleared of loiterers, since there was only one other person present, a woman wrapped in a long cloak that hid her face. As we were about to enter the canoe, this woman approached us and lifted her hood. She was Dramana. "Lord," she said, "I have been sent by my sister, the new Walloo, to tell you that you will find the iron tubes which spit out fire, and all that belongs to them under a mat in the prow of the canoe. Also she bids me wish you a prosperous journey to the island that aforetime was named Holy, which island she wishes never to see again." I thanked her, and bade her convey my greeting to the Walloo, my bride-to-be, adding in a loud voice that I hoped ere long to be able to do this in person when her veil fell down. Then I turned to enter the canoe. "Lord," said Dramana, with a convulsive movement of her hands, "I make a prayer to you. It is that you will take me with you to look my last upon that isle where I dwelt so long a slave, which I desire to see once more, now that I am free." Instinctively, I felt that a crisis had arisen which demanded firm and even brutal treatment. "Nay, Dramana," I answered, "it is always unlucky for an escaped slave to revisit his prison, lest once more its bars should close about that slave." "Lord," she said, "the loosened prisoner is sometimes dazed by freedom, so that the heart cries again for its captivity. Lord, I am a good slave, and a loving. Will you not take me with you?" "Nay, Dramana," I answered, as I sprang into the canoe. "This boat is fully loaded. It would not be for your welfare or for mine. Farewell." She gazed at me earnestly, with a pitiful countenance that grew wrathful by degrees, as might well happen in the case of a woman scorned. Then, muttering something about being cast off, burst into angry tears and turned away. For my part, I motioned to the oarsmen to loose the craft and departed, feeling like a thief and a traitor. Yet I was not to blame, for what else could I do? Dramana, it is true, had been a good friend to us, and I liked her, but we had repaid her help by saving her from Heu-Heu, and for the rest one must draw the line somewhere. If once she had entered that canoe, metaphorically speaking, she would never have got out of it again. Presently we were out on the open lake, where the wavelets danced and the sun shone brightly, and glad I was to be clear of all those painful complications. and once more in the company of pure and natural things. We paddled away to the island and made the land, or rather drew near to it, at the spot where the ancient city had stood, in which we had found the petrified men and animals. But we did not set foot on it, for everywhere little streams of glowing lava trickled down into the lake, and the ruins had vanished beneath a sea of ashes. I do not think that anyone will ever again behold those strange relics of a past I know not how remote. Turning, we paddled on slowly round the island till we came to the place where the rock of offering had been, upon which I had experienced so terrible an adventure. It had vanished, and with it the cave mouth, the garden of Heu-Heu, its tree of illusions, and all the rich cultivated land. The waters of the lake, turbid and steaming, now beat against the face of a stony hillock, which was all that remained of the holy isle. The catastrophe was complete. The volcano was but a lump of lava, from the dying heart of which its life-blood of flame still palpitated in red and ebbing streams. I wonder whether its smothered fires will ever break out again elsewhere. For aught I know, they may have done so already, somewhere on the mainland. By the time that we had completed our journey round the place, on which no living creature now was left, though once or twice we saw the bloated body of a Heu-Heu savage bobbing about in the water, the sun was setting, and it was dark before we were again off the town of the Walloos. While any light remained by which we could be seen, we headed straight for the landing place, that which we had left when we started for the island. The moment that its last rays faded, however, there was a whispered conference between our four paddlemen, the ex-neophytes of Heu-Heu. Then the direction of the canoe was altered, and instead of making for the main land, we rowed on parallel with it till we came to the mouth of the Black River. It was so dark that I could not discern the exact time at which we left the lake and entered the stream. Indeed, I did not know that we were in it until the increased current told me so. This current was now running very strongly after the great flood and bore us along at a good pace. My fear was lest in the gloom we should be dashed against rocks on the banks, or caught by the overhanging branches of trees, or strike a snag. But those four men seemed to know every yard of the river, and managed to keep us in its center, probably by feeling the current where it ran most swiftly. So we went on, not paddling very fast for fear of accidents, until the moon rose, which, as she was only a few days past her full, gave us considerable light even in that dark place. So soon as her rays reached us, our paddlers gave way with a will, and we shot down the flooded stream at a great speed. "I think we are all right now, boss," said Hans. "For with so good a start, those Walloos could scarcely catch us, even if they try. We are lucky, too, for you have left behind you two ladies, who between them would have torn you into pieces, and I have left a place where the fools who live in it wearied me so much that I should soon have died." He paused for a moment, then added in a horrified voice, "Alamakta! We are not so lucky after all. We have forgotten something." "What?" I asked anxiously. "Why, boss, those red and white stones we came to fetch, of which before Heu-Heu dropped a red-hot rock upon his head, that old Kronsick, that is mad. Walloo promised us as many as we wished. Sabeela would have filled the boat with them if we had only asked her, and we should never have had to work any more, but could have sat in fine houses and drunk the best gin from morning to night. At these words, I felt positively sick. It was too true. Amongst other pressing matters concerning life, death, marriage, and liberty, I had forgotten utterly all about the diamonds and gold. Still, when I came to think of it, although perhaps Hans might have done so, in view of the matter of our parting, I did not quite see how I could have asked Sabeela for them. It would have been an anticlimax, and might have left a nasty taste in her mouth. How could she continue to look upon a man as, well, something quite out of the ordinary, who called her back to remind her that there was a little pecuniary matter to be settled and a fee to be paid for services rendered? Further, the sight of us bearing sacks of treasure might have excited suspicion, unless indeed Sabeela had caused them to be placed in the boat as she did in the case of the guns. Also, they would have been heavy and inconvenient to carry, as I explained to Hans. Yet I did feel sick, for once more my hopes of wealth, or at any rate of a solid competence for the rest of my days, had vanished into thin air. Life is more than gold, I said sententiously to Hans, and great honor is better than both. It sounded like something out of the book of Proverbs, but somehow I had not got it quite right, though I reflected that fortunately Hans would not know the difference. However, he knew more than I thought, for he answered, "Yes, boss, your reverend father used to talk like that. Also he said that it was better to live on watercresses with an easy mind, however angry they might make your stomach, than to dwell in a big hut with a couple of cross women, which is what would have happened to you, boss, if you had stopped at Walloo. Besides, we are quite safe now, even if we haven't got the gold and diamonds, which, as you say, are heavy things. So safe that I think I shall go to sleep, boss." "Allamakta, boss, what's that?" "Only those poor hairy women howling over their dead in the forest," I answered rather carelessly, for their cries, which were very distressing in the silence of the river, still echoed in my ears. Also, I was still thinking of the lost diamonds. "I wish it were, boss. They might howl till their heads fell off for all I care, but it isn't. It's paddles. The Walloo are hunting us, boss. Listen." I did listen, and to my horror heard the regular stroke of paddles striking the water at a distance behind us, a great number of them, 50, I should say. One of the big canoes must be on our track. "Oh, boss," said Hans, "it is your fault again. Without doubt the Lady Germana loves you so much that she can't make up her mind to part with you, and has ordered out a big canoe to fetch you back. Unless indeed," he added with an access of hopefulness, "it is the Lady Sabeela sending a farewell gift of jewels after us, having remembered that we should like some to make us think of her afterwards." "It is those confounded Walloos sending a gift of spears," I answered gloomily, adding, "Get the rifles ready, Hans, for I am not going to be taken alive." Whatever the cause, it was clear that we were being pursued, and in my heart I did wonder whether Germana had anything to do with it. No doubt I had treated her rudely, because I could not help it, and savage women are sometimes very revengeful. Also, Germana had been badly trained among those rascally priests. But I hoped, and still hope, that she was innocent of this treachery. The truth of the matter I never learned. Our crew of escaping Priestley spies had also heard the paddles, for I saw the frightened look they gave to each other, and the fierce energy with which they bent themselves to their work. Good heavens, how they paddled, who knew that their lives hung upon the issue. For hour after hour, away we flew down that flooded rushing river, while behind us, drawing nearer, minute by minute, sounded the beat of those insistent paddles. Our canoe was swift, but how could we hope to escape from one driven by 50 men when we had but 4? It was just as we passed the place where we had slept on our inward journey. For now we had left the forest behind, and were between the cliffs, traveling quite twice as fast as we had done upstream, that I caught sight of the pursuing boat, perhaps half a mile behind us, and saw that it was one of the largest of the Walloo fleet. After this, owing to the position of the moon, that in this narrow place left the surface of the water quite dark, I saw it no more for several hours. But I heard it, drawing nearer, ever nearer, like some sure and deadly bloodhound, following on the spoor of a fleeing slave. Our men began to tire. Hans and I took the paddles of 2 of them to give the pair a rest and time to eat. Then, for a spell, the paddles of the other 2, which they did likewise. This, however, caused us to lose way, since we were not experts at the game, though here, after the flood, the river rushed so fast that our lack of skill made little difference. At length the daylight came and gathered, till at last the glimmer of it reached us in our cleft, and by that faint, uncertain light, I saw the pursuing canoe not 100 yards behind. In its way, it was a very weird and impressive spectacle. There were the precipitous towering cliffs, between, or rather above which appeared a line of blue sky. There was the darksome, flood-filled, foaming river, and there on its surface was our tiny boat, propelled by 4 weary and perspiring men, while behind came the great war canoe, whose presence could just be detected in a dim outline, and by the white of the water where its oarsmen smote it into froth. "They are coming up fast, boss, and we still have a long way to go. Soon they will catch us, boss," said Hans. "Then we must try to stop them for a while," I answered grimly. "Give me the express rifle, Hans, and do you take the Winchester." Then, lying down in the canoe, and resting the rifles on its stern, we waited our opportunity. Presently we came to a place where at some time there had been a cliffside, for here the debris of it narrowed the river, turning it, now that it was so full, into something like a torrent. At this spot also, because of the enlargement of the cleft, more light reached us, so that we could see our pursuers, who were about 50 yards away, not clearly indeed, but well enough for our purpose. "Aim low and pump it into them, Hans," I said, and the next instant discharged both barrels of the express at the foremost rowers. Hans followed suit, but as the Winchester held 5 cartridges, went on firing after I had ceased. The result was instantaneous. Some men sank down, some paddles fell into the water, I could not tell how many, and a great cry arose from the smitten or their companions. He who steered or captained the canoe from the prow apparently was among the hit. She veered round, and for a while was broadside onto the current, exposing her bottom and threatening to turn over. Into this, having loaded, I sent 2 expanding bullets, hoping to spring a leak in her, though I was not certain if I should succeed, as the wood of these canoes is thick. I think I did, however, since even when she had got on her course again, she came more slowly, and I thought that once I saw a man bailing. On we went, making the most of the advantage that this check gave to us. But by now our men were very tired, and their hands were raw from blisters, so that only the terror of death forced them to continue paddling. Indeed, at the last, our progress grew very slow, and in fact was due more to the current than to our own efforts. Therefore the following canoe, which, as was customary in Walloo boats of that size, probably carried spare paddlemen, once more gained upon us. Hereabouts the river wound between its cliffs, so that we only got sight of it from time to time. Whenever we did so, I took the Winchester and fired, no doubt inflicting some damage and checking its advance. At length the winding ceased, and we reached the last stretch, a clear run of a mile or so, before the river ended in the swamp that I have described. By this time pursuers and pursued, both of us, were going but slowly, drifting rather than paddling, since all were exhausted. Whenever I could get a sight, I fired away, but still with a sullen determination, and in utter silence, our assailants came up, till now they were scarcely 20 paces from us, and some of them threw spears, one of which stuck in the bottom of our canoe, just missing my foot. At this spot, the cliffs drew so near together at the top that I ceased shooting, as I could not see to aim, and having no cartridges to waste, decided to keep those that remained for the emergency of the last attack. Now we were in the ultimate reach of the river, and now at last we grounded upon the first mud bank of the swamp. Those who remained unhurt of the following Walloos made a final effort to overtake us. By that strong light that flowed from the open land beyond us, I could see their glaring eyeballs and their tongues hanging from their jaws with exhaustion. I yelled an order. "Seize everything we have and run for it," I cried, grabbing at my rifle and such other articles as were within reach, including the remaining cartridges. The others did likewise. I do not think that anything was left in that canoe except the paddles. Then I leaped onto the shore and ran to the right, following the edge of the swamp, the rest coming after me. 50 yards or more away, I sank down upon a little ridge from sheer exhaustion, and because my cramped legs would no longer carry me, and watched to see what would happen. Indeed, I was so worn out that I felt I would rather die where I was than to try to flee further. We grouped ourselves together, awaiting the crisis, for I thought that surely we should be attacked, but we were not. At the mud bank, the pursuing Walloos ceased from their efforts. For a little while they sat dejectedly in their craft, till they had recovered breath. Then for the first time those mute hunting hounds gave tongue, for they shouted maledictions on us, and especially on our four-paddlers, the neophytes of Heu-Heu, telling these that, although to follow them further was not lawful, they would die, as Zikal died who left the land. One of our men, stung into repartee, retaliated in words to the effect that some of them had died in attempting to keep us in the land, as they would find if they counted their oarsmen. To this obvious truth the pursuers made no answer, nor did they inform us who sent them on the chase. Securing our small canoe, they laid in it certain dead men who had fallen beneath the bullets of Hans and myself, and departed slowly upstream, towing it after them. This was the last I saw of their handsome fanatical faces, and of their confounded country, in which I went so near to death, or to becoming a prisoner for life, that might have been worse. "Boss," said Hans, lighting his pipe, "that was a great journey, and one which it will be nice to think about, now that it is over, though I wish that we had killed more of those Walloo man-stealers." "I don't, Hans. I hated being obliged to shoot them," I answered, "nor do I wish to think any more of that race for our lives, unless it comes back in a nightmare when I can't help doing so." "Don't you, boss? I find such thoughts pleasant when the danger is past, and we who might have been dead are alive, and the others who were alive are dead, and telling the tale to Heu-Heu." "Each to his taste. Yours isn't mine," I muttered. Hans puffed at his pipe for a while and went on. "It's funny, boss, that those Carls did not get out of their canoe and come to kill us with their spears. I suppose they were afraid of the rifles." "No, Hans," I answered. "They are brave men who would not have stopped because of bullets. They were afraid of more than these. They feared the curse, which says that those who leave the land will die and go to hell. Heu-Heu has done us a good turn there, Hans." "Yes, boss. No doubt he has become a Christian in the place of fires, and is repaying good for evil, turning the other cheek, boss. Bad people often grow holy when they are dying, boss. I felt like that myself when I thought those Walloos were going to catch us, but now I feel quite different. Boss, you remember how your Reverend Father used to say that if you love heaven, heaven looks after you and pulls you out of every kind of mud hole. That's why I'm sitting here smoking, boss, instead of making meat for crocodiles. If it wasn't for our forgetting about those jewels, it has looked after us very well, but there are so many up there that perhaps heaven forgot them also." "No, Hans," I said. "Heaven remembered that if we had tried to carry bags of stone out of that boat, as well as Zikali's medicine and the rest, the Walloos would have caught us before we got away. They were quite close, Hans." "Yes, boss, I see, and that was very nice of heaven. And now, boss, I think we had better be moving. Those Walloos might forget about the curse for a little while and come back to look for us. Heaven is a queer thing, boss. Sometimes it changes its face all of a sudden and grows angry, just like the Lady Dramana did when you said that you wouldn't take her with you in the canoe yesterday." Allan paused to help himself to a little weak whiskey and water, then said in his jerky fashion, "Well, that's the end of the story, of which I am glad, whatever you may be, for my throat is dry with talking. We got back to the wagon all right after sundry difficulties, and a tiring march across the desert, and it was time we did so, for when we arrived we had only 3 rifle cartridges left between us. You see, we were obliged to fire such a lot at the Heu-Heu when they attacked us on the lake, and afterwards at those Walloos, to prevent them from catching us that night. However, there were more in the wagon, and I shot 4 elephants with them going home. They had very large tusks, which afterwards I sold for about enough to cover the expenses of the journey." "Did old Zikal make you pay for those oxen?" I asked. "No, he did not, because I told him that if he tried it on, I would not give him his bundle of muti that we cut from the Tree of Illusions and carried safely all that way. So, as he was very keen on the medicine, he made me a present of the oxen. Also I found my own there, grown fat and strong again. It was a curious thing, but the old scoundrel seemed to know most of what had happened to us before I ever told him a word. Perhaps he learned it all from one of those acolytes of Heu-Heu who fled with us because they feared that they would be murdered if they stayed in their own land. I forgot to tell you that those men, most uncommunicative persons, melted away upon our homeward journey. Suddenly they were missing. I presume that they departed to set up as witch doctors on their own account. If so, very possibly one or more of them may have come into touch with Zikal, the head of the craft in that part of Africa, and before I reached the Black Kloof. The first thing he asked me was, "Why did you not bring any gold and diamonds away with you? Had you done so, you might have become rich, who now remain poor, Macumazahn." "Because I forgot to ask for them," I said. "Yes, I know you forgot to ask for them. You were thinking so much of the pain of saying goodbye to that beautiful lady, whose name I have not learned, that you forgot to ask for them. It is just like you, Macumazahn. Oh ho, it is just like you." Then he stared at his fire for a while, in front of which, as usual, he was sitting, and added, "Yet somehow I think that diamonds will make you rich one day, when there is no woman left to say goodbye to, Macumazahn." It was a good shot of his, for, as you fellows know, that came about at King Solomon's Mines, didn't it, when there was no woman left to say goodbye to? Here Good turned his head away, and Allan went on hurriedly, I think because he remembered Foulata, and saw that his thoughtless remark had given pain. Zikal was very interested in all our story. It made me stop at the Black Kloof for some days to tell him every detail. "I knew that Heu-Heu was an idol," he said, "though I wanted you to find it out for yourself, and therefore told you nothing about it, just as I knew that handsome man Zikal would die. But I didn't tell him anything about that either, because if I had, you see, he might have died before he had shown you the way to his country, and then I shouldn't have got my muti, which is necessary to me, for without it, how should I paint more pictures on my fire? Well, you brought me a good bundle of leaves, which will last my time, and as the tree of illusions is burned, and there is no other left in the world, there will be no more of it. I am glad that it is burned, for I do not wish that any wizard should arise in the land, who will be as great as was Zikal, opener of roads. While that tree grew, the high priest of Heu-Heu was almost as great, but now he is dead, and his tree is burned, and I, Zikal, reign alone. That is what I desired, Macumazahn, and that is why I sent you to Heu-Heu land." "You cunning old villain!" I exclaimed. "Yes, Macumazahn, I am cunning, just as you are simple, and my heart is black like my skin, just as yours is white like your skin. That is why I am great, Macumazahn, and wield power over thousands, and accomplish my desires, whereas you are small, and have no power, and will die with all your desires unaccomplished. Yet in the end, who knows, who knows? Perhaps in the land beyond it may be otherwise. Heu-Heu was great also, and where is Heu-Heu today?" "There never was a Heu-Heu," I said. "No, Macumazahn, there never was a Heu-Heu, but there were priests of Heu-Heu. Is it not so with many of the gods men set up? They are not, and never were, but their priests are, and shake the spear of power, and pierce the hearts of men with terrors. What then does it matter about the gods whom no man sees, when the priest is there shaking the spear of power, and piercing the hearts of their worshippers? The god is the priest, or the priest is the god. Have it which way you like, Macumazahn." "Not always, Zikal." Then, as I did not wish to enter into argument with him on such a subject, I asked, "Who carved the statue of Heu-Heu in the Cave of Illusions?" The Walloos did not know. "Nor do I, Macumazahn," he answered. The world is very old, and there have been peoples in it of whom we have heard nothing, or so my spirit tells me. Without doubt, one of those peoples carved it thousands of years ago, an invading people, the last of their race, who had been driven out elsewhere, and coming south, those who were left of them hid themselves away from their enemies in this secret place, amid a horde of savages so hideous that it was reported to be haunted by demons. There in a cave, in the midst of a lake where they could not be come at, they carved an image of their god, or perhaps of the god of the savages, whom it seems that it resembled. Mayhap the savages took their name from Heu-Heu, or mayhap Heu-Heu took his name from them. Who can tell? At any rate, when men seek a god, Macumazahn, they make one like themselves, only larger, uglier, and more evil, at least in this land, for what they do elsewhere I know not. Also, often they say that this god was once their king, since at the bottom all worship their ancestors who gave them life, if they worship anything at all, and often too, because they gave them life, they think that they must have been devils. Great ancestors were the first gods, Macumazahn, and if they had not been evil, they would never have been great. Look at Chaka, the lion of the Zulus. He is called great because he was so wicked and cruel, and so it was, and is with others if they succeed, though if they fail, men speak otherwise of them. That is not a pretty faith, Zikal, I said. No, Macumazahn, but then little in the world is pretty, except the world itself. The Heu-Heu are not pretty, or rather were not, for I think that you killed most of them when you blew up the mountain, which is a good thing. Heu-Heu was not pretty, nor were his priests. Only the Walloos, and especially their women, remain pretty because of the old blood that runs in them, the high old blood that Heu-Heu sucked from their veins. Well, Heu-Heu has gone, Zikal, and now what will become of the Walloos? I cannot say, Macumazahn, but I expect they will follow Heu-Heu, who has taken hold of their souls, and will drag them after him. If so, it does not matter, since they are but the rotting stump of a tree that once was tall and fair. The dust of time hides many such stumps, Macumazahn. But what of that? Other fine trees are growing, which also will become stumps in their season, and so on forever. Thus Zikal held forth, though of what he said I forget much. I dare say that he spoke truth, but I remember that his melancholy and pessimistic talk depressed me, and that I cut it as short as I could. Also, it did not really explain anything, since he could not tell me who the Walloos or the hairy folk were, or why they worshipped Heu-Heu, or what was their beginning, or what would be their end. All these things remained, and remain, lost in mystery, since I have never heard anything more of them, and if any subsequent travelers have visited the district where they live, which is not probable, they did not succeed in ascending the river, or if they did, they never descended it again. So if you want to know more of the story, you must go and find it out for yourselves. Only, as I think I said, I won't go with you. Well, said Captain Good, it is a wonderful yarn. Hang me if I could have told it better myself. No good, answered Allan, as he lit a hand candle. I am quite sure that you could not, because, you see, facts are one thing, and what you call yarns are another. Good night to you all. Good night. Then he went off to bed. The End. End of Section 16. End of Heu-Heu, or the Monster, by H. Rider Haggard. Read by Derek Trial.